Hello and welcome. My name is Tanya. I'm part of the Skoll Foundation team, and I'm just so excited to welcome you to the Skoll World Forum session, The Dangerous Decline in Democracy. We're just so honored to have an impressive group of speakers here to learn from and engage with today. And before we start, I just want to share a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. So this session is being recorded and it will be released publicly after the event, so you can rewatch if you miss anything. Language translation is available. You can access the translation options in the translation tabs to the right of the video window. And please feel free to use the chat to engage with each other and pose questions to the speakers. The moderator will turn to audience questions towards the end of the session. Social media, we're using the hashtag SkollWF, and would love for you to do the same if you're so inclined. And after the session, you can join small group roundtable discussions on related topics by clicking the Discuss and Meetup button on the left side of the video screen. And with that, I'm really happy to introduce this session's moderator, Blair Glencorse, the founder and executive director of Accountability Lab. With that, happy to turn it over to Blair.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Tanya. Thank you so much and welcome to our session on the dangerous decline of democracy. Thanks to the Skoll Foundation for organizing this session, for all of the Foundation's support to social innovators globally, and for the huge dose of inspiration that we've already had today from our awardees and the sessions so far. My name is Blair Glencorse. As you heard, I run an organization called the Accountability Lab. We are a trans-local network of organizations that make governance work for people around the world. And I have the honor of moderating our discussion today. And as we all know, and as we heard from Ambassador Power earlier today, there are some extremely worrying trends when it comes to democracy globally at the moment. Nearly half of the world's population now live in countries that are deemed not free, which is the greatest proportion since 1997. The Russian war in Ukraine is just one example of an emboldened authoritarian seeking to undermine democracy elsewhere. But just this last weekend in the same region, the populist Viktor Orban won a non-democratic election in Hungary. In the Sahel region of Africa, which is a place that we at the Accountability Lab do a lot of work, there have been 5 coups and 1 attempted coup in the last year. In Latin America, populists like Bolsonaro and Maduro have used COVID-19 as an excuse to close civic space and clamp down on civil liberties. And in Asia, we continue to see troubling trends in non-democratic countries around issues of corruption and human rights in places like China, for example. But in the West, we also have our own crises of democratic legitimacy at home, as politics have become more deeply polarized and partisan, and non-democratic forces have gained momentum. The insurrection in the US last year being just one manifestation of this. And equally, citizens in many countries have become indifferent or desensitized to some of these non-democratic trends. And this has undermined our ability to push back against democratic backsliding at home and abroad. But at the same time, I think there's some hugely encouraging signs, and there's plenty of data to suggest that democracy still remains a universal aspiration for citizens everywhere. And I'm joined by some truly inspirational speakers and thinkers and activists today to talk through both these challenges, but also some of their incredible work to find solutions to these problems of democratic decline. So I hope that this will fill you with hope for the future of democracy. And I'd like to briefly introduce them to you all. We have Ambassador Patrick Gaspard, President of the Center for American Progress in the United States. We have Patrick Ali, co-founder and director of Global Witness, that works globally on these issues. We have Alessandra Orofino, executive director of NOSSAS in Brazil and a Skoll awardee this year. We have Ian Bassin, executive director of the Protect Democracy Project in the United States. And finally, Berta Valle, a journalist and advocate in Nicaragua. So to begin with, I'd like to turn to you, Ambassador Gaspard, if I may, and touch on a topic that is on everyone's minds, of course, and that's Ukraine. It's such a human, but also democratic tragedy. Given your deep experience working on these issues around the world, from a variety of different perspectives, you've been a US ambassador, you've been president of the Open Society Foundations. Can you provide your views on what's happening in Ukraine and why this matters for democracy?
Thank you for inviting me in, Blair. And I want to thank Skoll for giving us all this platform. And it's just a great honor to join these incredible panelists. So Blair, I think that we should break down what's happening in the Ukraine right now into its raw political foundational element, which is that Vladimir Putin intends or intended to restore the czarist borders of Russia. He had this ambition for some time now over the course of his 22-year career of leading Russia to restore it to its imperial borders. He's made that clear in his rhetoric, and now he makes it abundantly clear in his actions. I know that there are some in all the spaces that we sit in, countries that we're in, who have rallied over time to the defense of Russia, who suggest that the actions that he takes now, or as a consequence of the actions from the EU or from NATO, that couldn't be further from the truth. At least a decade ago, Putin said things like, it is a God-given mandate and destiny that Ukraine will be united back into Russia, that Russia will have its imperial borders yet again. He has consistently denied the existence of the notion of a Ukrainian nation. And his actions, not just the invasion, but the brutality of the attacks against civilian centers, makes it clear that he intends to literally wipe Ukrainians from the face of that space, to take over the geography, but to also lead to a kind of Russification of the Ukraine. The only reason, I'd say the only reason that we're in a position right now where the EU's united, where the United States has been able to assert its leadership, and where we can clearly delineate this as a moment of democracy versus autocracy, is because of the courage, the heroics of the Ukrainian people themselves. If the Ukrainians didn't fight back at this moment, didn't say this is not going to happen now, if President Zelensky didn't rally the world, I hate to say that perhaps there would have been some minor sanctions, but we would not be at this moment of real unity, focus of purpose, and intentional strategy to beat back Putin's ambitions and to reverse the course of these repugnant and reprehensible actions. This is going to have long-term ramifications for realignments in the world, in the world of economic statecraft. Certainly has implications for the role of China in the world, where Russia becomes much more dependent on China. But it has implications as well for our domestic budgets in the US and in Europe, where you will see greater investments in the next several years on security, on military defense. But as you say, it also brings this sharp focus, things like the Democracy Summit discussion that happened a few months ago, the Summit of the Americas that's upcoming, and the opportunity for Germany, France, the United States, Japan, Canada, et cetera, to advance a new proposition of what broadly shared consensus ought to look like on human rights and on democracy.
Thank you, Ambassador. I wanted to pick up on that point you made about some of the larger trends, if I may. How do you think those will evolve after or even during this war in Ukraine? And what should we as the international community, as people that I presume are interested in supporting democracy, what should we be doing differently to support democratic trends and democratic leaders going forwards?
Well, Blair, I think the first thing that we all need to do is to have a sober understanding that there is nothing that's linear and guaranteed about the forward march of democracy. There's a study that Center for American Progress presented a few short years ago that took a 140-year look at 20 leading economies in the world, and demonstrated that every single moment over the last 140 years, when there's been a pronounced economic downturn, that's followed by a significant increase in the political support, the electoral support that extreme illiberals receive in democratic spaces. So we know that there is nothing linear here. There's nothing guaranteed. We've all seen all of the data that shows us the backsliding, not just in autocratic spaces, but in democratic spaces as well. And we know that if we're not working every single day to ensure more inclusive growth, more broadly shared, participatory institutions of prosperity, that the attraction of a liberalism, the attraction of autocracy grows each day. We also, I think, Blair, need to be hyper aware of the fact that the communications revolution that we're living through right now actually has diminished democratic conversation, civic discourse in a way that's forced everybody into our own algorithmic house of mirrors. And there's got to be a way that if you're having the conversation about democracy and about inclusion and consensus building, that we've got to address the regulatory environment around the information space as well. There are models of how progress can be made on that front from Europe, Latin America, in Asia. But we've got to move in a more urgent way in those spaces.
Thank you, Ambassador. So much in there for us to unpack. But let me turn now, Patrick, Ali, to you, if I may. You're a Skoll awardee. You're a Nobel Peace Prize nominee for your work to fight corruption with Global Witness. You've just written a book with the excellent title, Very Bad People. Who are these bad people and how are they coming together to undermine democracy in your view?
Thanks, Blair. There's an apocryphal saying that in London, you're never more than 6 feet away from a rat. Well, corruption's a bit like that. I wrote Very Bad People, shameless plug, which is a very nice endorsement from Jeff Skoll, to make the world of corruption and its implications accessible to a wider public. In his foreword to the book, George Soros wrote that corruption is one of the greatest threats to democracy, and he's right. People often associate corruption with some bribe paid to a political leader in some far-off tropical country, but corruption is a truly globalized industry. Using the UK as an example, as Boris Johnson announced sanctions against Russian oligarchs this March, he said, there can be no safe havens for those who supported Putin's vicious assault on Ukraine. By happy coincidence, No Safe Havens is the name of one of the chapters in the book, and it describes how London has in fact been the safe haven of choice for years. Every corrupt deal needs a bank, and as a financial centre, the UK provides a gold star service. The corrupt want to spend their wealth in the world's most exclusive destinations. And according to Transparency International, around £6.7 billion worth of questionable funds has been invested in UK property since 2016, with another £1.5 billion of that being by Russians accused of corruption or of links to the Kremlin. And the UK is also a home to what I call a pinstripe army of enablers, including the banks, company formation agents, accountancy firms, reputation launderers, lawyers, and real estate agents who want to make a fast buck out of the super corrupt. And at the top of the tree are our political leaders who all too easily fall under the spell of the super rich. The corrupt crave respectability, and they strive all too successfully to become the new upper class. They join the best clubs, make political donations and schmooze with our political leaders, send their kids to top private schools and then to Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or Princeton. The criminal money buys them a place in our ruling elites. In this, corruption is like a cancer eating the heart out of our democracy. At the same time, whilst the UK has been a safe haven for the corrupt, it's been a very hostile environment for anti-corruption NGOs like Global Witness and investigative journalists, because it's the libel capital of the world, where some of London's top law firms court clients like the oligarchs and use the weight of their billions to try and intimidate and crush fair reporting and effectively suppress freedom of speech. Putin's Russia is the ultimate expression of corruption and the suppression of democracy. And in this, his regime and his oligarch allies owe much to the West's financial centres, the tolerance of our leaders and their love of money and power. So, like the rats in London, you're never far from one of the rats in the pinstripe army.
Thank you, Patrick. And I love the focus on the pinstripe army and the enablers in Western countries that are perpetuating the corrupt networks that exist. So that, I suppose, brings us to a question at the global level as to how we can collectively mobilize to push back against these networks of bad people, of corrupt actors. What does an effective network of good people look like in your mind?
Well, I think it's a really big question, of course, and there are many different groups working on various aspects of democracy. But I think in this case, we all need to work together and do what we're skilled at doing. And for us, one of the main things right now that we can do to protect democracy is this. The OECD described the oil industry as one of the most corrupt on the planet. We feel that impact of that every day in our lives as hugely wealthy fossil fuel companies who are growing around twice as fast as they would in terms of profits right now because of the war, buy politicians in the US and elsewhere with political donations, flood the corridors of power with political lobbyists, and fund multi-billion-dollar climate disinformation campaigns. And in addition to the terrible impacts on our climate of their industry, the history of the last 100 years is peppered with oil-funded dictatorships, wars, coups, and human rights abuses. Think about Saudi Arabia or Iran or Myanmar and Iraq. And now we have one which has brought back the spectre of nuclear war. Since Russia's annexation of the Crimea in 2014, 8 of the world's biggest oil companies have paid over $100 billion to Russia. And this wonderful app, if anyone can see this, it's actually, I can see it's blanked out, from Beyond Coal, clocks up in real time just how much the EU has spent on Russian oil and gas since the Russian invasion, which is just under an astonishing 20 billion euros in the last 6 weeks or so. Now, hydrocarbons make up 56% of Russia's export earnings and 39% of its revenue. So right now, stopping buying Russian hydrocarbons is one of the most powerful things we can do. And we need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels so we're not dependent on Putin or any other tin pot dictator who's in league with one of the most corrupt industries on the planet for our energy needs. So, coming to your question, what does a network of very good people look like? Well, it looks like the youth climate movement, progressive politicians, the anti-corruption movement, those people on the ground who are daily risking their lives defending their land against exploitation by the fossil fuel and other industries. And of course, none of this is possible without philanthropies like Skoll. But one thing I just want to end on, most of all, we need to be tackling the root of this problem, not just picking up the pieces in the aftermath, which is what we're having to do now. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And absolutely, corruption is a cause, not just a consequence of all of these problems. So we need to get to it at its roots. And I wanted to turn to you, Alessandra, as somebody who's trying to do that, who is perhaps one of the good people that Patrick mentioned. You're a winner of the Skoll Award for Social Innovation this year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you, as I heard earlier during your session, see the solution to these problems as collective action. Can you tell us a bit more about your work to build the bottom-up movement in support of democracy in Brazil?
Yeah, of course. So for the past 10 years, I've been leading NOSSAS, which is an organization working in Brazil across the country to help activists better accomplish the change that they want to see in the world, better organize, identify issues that they can act on, really mobilize their community around those issues and get results in terms of policy changes, service implementation, or even just direct collective solutions that are found through solidarity and huge solidarity networks. We mobilize millions of people around a range of issues. And oftentimes in our work, what we encounter is very similar to what Patrick was just describing. We see a lot of sort of individuals who have become very wealthy through different means, not always the most honest means, who then sort of sequester, kidnap democracy, because that wealth gives them a lot of access. It gives them access to every decision maker, essentially, either in the judiciary, in the executive, in the legislative, and they essentially put the institutions of democracy to work for them and for them exclusively. What we found is that it's really hard to fight that at the individual level, because we're talking about people who have so much money, so much influence, so much status, that it's just impossible to fight them. But if you do it together, if you can really mobilize a community of people, then you stand a chance. It's still a hard fight, but you start to stand a chance. And you start to undermine, I think, in many ways, that narrative, which, as Patrick alluded to, is so important to certain corrupt individuals, that sort of story that they tell themselves about themselves as being righteous and good people themselves, and they sort of buy acceptance into a world that they regard as exclusive or important or status driven. When you create collective mobilization, when you deploy people power, you start sort of undermining that narrative, making it impossible for certain individuals to sustain this idea of themselves as being good and righteous in spite of the terrible things that they may be doing to their own communities, which is often the case here in Brazil.
Thanks, Alessandra. And I think, as you insinuated, one of the reasons why your work seems to resonate is that it solves concrete problems for citizens. It's things in their everyday lives that they are having issues with. And so I wonder how you think we can collectively make democracy more real for people so they get more involved in defending it beyond voting in elections.
Yeah. Of course. So just for context, right? Brazilian democracy is very young. We've only been a democracy for about 33, 34 years. It's pretty much as long as I've been alive. I was born the year Brazilians voted in a direct election for president for the first time since the beginning of the military dictatorship, which dominated the country for many, many years. So for a long time, Brazilians had to really fight for democracy, right? It was really hard to get there. And once we got there, very quickly we sort of became complacent. It seemed as if just having the institutions of democracy in place, the sort of protocol of democracy in place, was enough. And I think very quickly we forgot that democracy is not about elections. It's not about sort of following rights, even though sometimes these sort of rituals are important. But it's about sort of an everyday effort to make decisions more available to people, to include everyone in decision making in a way that really changes the dynamics of power within society. And you can't do that unless people believe in democracy. I think what's happening in Brazil and in many other countries around the world, as far as I know and as I've been able to follow, is that a lot of people who have been sort of pushed out of democratic life, not necessarily disenfranchised in the most obvious way. They may still be able to vote, for instance, but in virtually any other way, they have been sort of pushed out. They start losing faith in democratic institutions altogether. And when that happens, it's very easy to turn to a savior, to turn to sort of a strongman figure who promises to sort of better everyone's lives without democracy standing in the way. And because democracy is something that doesn't seem to be adding any value to your daily life, why on earth would you mobilize to save it? So in my view, the only way that we can really sustain democratic values and institutions in the long term is by making society itself more democratic, making sure that people can really participate when they want to, when their lives are at stake, when their livelihoods and their community and their families' lives are at stake, and ensuring that no one individual or group of individuals can really sort of kidnap the institutions of democracy in a way that only serves them. Because if that happens, then you lose that sort of popular support that you need in order to fight for this. I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is a good example of that, of what happens when a people really believes in a system and is ready to fight for them, for that system. If you lose that faith, then you have nothing. And it's very easy for sort of these strongman figures to then essentially say that their way is the better way, and then you don't actually need democracy, or the democracy is actually a bad thing. You may be standing in the way of solving some issues and some problems.
Thank you, Alessandra. A quick reminder to our watchers, please do put any questions you might have in the comments box, and we'll get to those in a minute. And talking, Ian, of losing faith in democratic institutions and strongmen, your work focuses on the threats to democracy in the US in particular. Could you talk a little bit about how these threats manifested in the US and how have they evolved, if at all, since the attack on the Capitol just over a year ago, and how your work addresses these threats?
Yeah, well, thanks, Blair. As you noted at the top, we are living through this recession of the third wave of democracies here in the 21st century. And of course, in 2016, that recession landed on America's shores when, as Alessandra noted, a strong man came along to the United States and said, I alone can fix everything. And when that happened, when Donald Trump was elected, we formed Protect Democracy for the explicit mission of preventing US democracy from declining into a more autocratic form of government. And when we did that, we assembled some of the leading scholars on the 21st century decline of democracies to understand, is there a consistent playbook that you see around the world, from Hungary to Turkey, as these autocrats have come to power, that we could understand in order to prevent that playbook from manifesting here in the United States. And indeed, there really is. There's a very consistent playbook that plays out whether the person atop the autocratic movement is deliberate and strategic and Machiavellian, the way that someone like a Vladimir Putin or a Viktor Orban is, or whether they're almost sort of bumbling and accidental, the way a Nicolas Maduro or Donald Trump are. They all do essentially the same 6 things. The first is that they politicize independent institutions like law enforcement, the civil service, the military. We saw Donald Trump try to do that here with the Department of Justice and the FBI. The second is they spread disinformation from the government on matters large and small, and we've obviously witnessed that ad nauseum here in the United States in the last several years. They aggrandize executive power and try to undercut those institutions that are supposed to be checks on executive power, like legislatures, judiciaries, the free press, even the private sector. Fourth, they quash dissent, not through the old traditional methods of banning books, but what Orban did in Hungary was he used the regulatory power of the state to go after media that was critical of his party and make it hard for them to turn a profit. And of course, here in the United States, we saw Donald Trump's Justice Department bring an antitrust action against AT&T and Time Warner explicitly because the president said he didn't like the coverage of CNN, which was owned by those companies. And then fifth, they delegitimize vulnerable populations. This has been the tyrant's tool since antiquity. Divide and conquer, turn the people against themselves, and then you can pick their pockets when they're not looking. And we've seen this in Eastern Europe with the demonization of migrants. We've seen it in the United States with the demonization of immigrants and communities of color. Donald Trump is playing right out of that playbook. And then last, of course, and this is what we saw in the lead up to and the aftermath of the 2020 election here in the United States, corrupt elections. Because what all these autocrats know is that democracy is too steeped in the public consciousness to simply abolish it outright, as dictators would do in the 20th century. No, in the 21st century, these dictators hold elections. They manage Potemkin democracies that are only democracies on the surface. And Blair, you noted at the beginning, Viktor Orban only quote unquote won an election in Hungary recently because he has spent the last 3 terms undermining the threads of free and fair elections to make it so it's a rigged playing field. And that's what these autocrats do. And that's, of course, what Donald Trump tried to do in 2020. And his allies are now trying to do that in advance of the 2024 election here in the United States to make it so that that election might see an effort to overthrow it that succeeds where the effort to overthrow the 2020 election fails. So we're seeing this playbook play out across the world and, of course, also here in the United States.
Thanks, Ian. So there's an autocratic playbook. What does a democratic playbook look like? What are the tactics that you're finding are working to push back against some of this democratic backsliding?
Well, let's start with a note of massive optimism, which is here in the United States, we turned an autocrat out of power in 4 years. That rarely happens around the world. So for all of the important identification of the doom and gloom threats that I and my fellow panelists are identifying, let's just be aware that the movement for democracy is winning. Right? It's winning here in the United States. The bravery of the Ukrainian people and the coalition of not just the West, but democratic states around the world are coming together. So I think we are looking at an optimistic future, but it's only because people are picking up the tools that they have been given to make democracy work. So for example, our organization here in the United States, our legal team recently convinced a court to allow us to put the former president on trial for the events leading up to January 6th. Our legislative team just helped pass provisions in a bill that we helped create called the Protecting Our Democracy Act into law in order to reimpose checks on the presidency. And we've got a media team that is allowing former civil servants from DOJ alumni to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman to dominate media cycles as the voice of how democracy is supposed to work. And that's just one organization that's part of a growing coalition here in the United States to protect democracy and push back on authoritarianism. But here's the key. We've got to make sure that that coalition is ideologically broad, includes progressives, includes moderates, includes conservatives, includes Democrats, includes Republicans, because what we are learning from around the world is in order to defeat authoritarianism, you have to have a broad coalition of people who disagree about the typical policy and political issues of the day, but agree on the foundational point of democracy. And here's the other thing, we have to do it now, because as the Hungarians unfortunately learned this weekend, waiting 3 elections to get that coalition together is too late. You got to do it early. And I think we can do that here in the United States, but that's what we've got to focus on is bringing that coalition together to defeat authoritarianism in the United States, to help protect democracy and return the United States to being one of the leaders in the world for protecting democracy globally.
Thank you, Ian. Again, lots to pick up on there, I think, in what you've said in the Q&A, which we will come to after we hear from Berta, who is unable to join us, unfortunately, today because she's working at the Human Rights Council of the UN in Geneva. But I had the chance to speak to her earlier, and this is what she said. Great. Now let me turn to you, Berta, if that's okay. You have very direct personal experience working in an undemocratic society in Nicaragua. Can you tell us briefly your story and why this issue of democracy and support for democracy matters so much to you?
Thank you, Blair. And I'm so grateful to be here and have this opportunity to share what is happening in Nicaragua. So my husband, Felix Maradiaga, has been a human rights defender and a social entrepreneur during all his life. Myself, I've been a journalist for almost 15 years working in the media in Nicaragua. So for many years, my husband has been warning about the situation that we are now in. And since 2018, when the massive protest started in Nicaragua, there have been a crackdown of democracy and human rights with an unprecedented wave of repression to silent challengers and critics of the regime. So since 2018, because of this situation, my mother-in-law and our daughter Alejandra, who is now 8 years old, have to come into exile to the US for security reasons. And Felix decided to go back to Nicaragua to fight for democracy. And last year, during the context of the national elections in November 2021, Daniel Ortega detained and disappeared almost 170 individuals, including 7 presidential candidates, party leaders, activists, journalists, students, peasant leaders, and business people. Their detention is a desperate attempt of the regime of Daniel Ortega to do anything to claim to power. And like them, my husband has been illegally jailed and tortured for over 300 days. He is a prisoner of conscience under the Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo regime just because he was trying to run as a presidential candidate. In February this year, together with 6 other political leaders, he was condemned to 13 years of prison in a so-called trial, which for us is actually a judicial farce due to that violation of the due process and to the illegal laws where they were condemned with. So that put me in a very clear position to fight for the freedom of my husband, Felix Maradiaga, but also for the freedom of this more than 170 political prisoners in Nicaragua, and at the end, for the freedom of my country. Right now, we are suffering of a incredible amount of Nicaraguan having going to exile coming to the US, for example, or to Costa Rica, and we have experienced a humanitarian crisis. So that's why I've been advocating in different countries with different leaders to ask for help and to ask the international community to work together in a coordinated way to actually demonstrate the dictator in Nicaragua that he cannot be acting with this impunity and that he must respect human rights of all Nicaraguans.
Thank you, Berta. Your work is so important and so inspiring, but so dangerous. I know the government of Nicaragua has also been investigating you under a controversial law, accusing you of being a traitor for the work that you have been doing.
That's right.
Could you touch briefly on the kinds of support that human rights defenders such as yourself need? How can the international community best support people like you to fight for democracy?
Yes, well, there are many ways you can help. first help us to raise our voice. I have noticed that in some places they know that something is happening in Nicaragua, but when you go into the details of human rights violations, people is very surprised. And also, and this is why I'm so grateful for this platform, is for people to get involved in any area where they are, because we have done everything we can inside, and there's no possibility right now for us to keep this job going on, and to call to the international community to have this coordinated action too. It's very important. So I really appreciate from the bottom of my heart any help you can give us.
Thank you again to Berta for her important and inspirational work. We're going to open it up for questions. Thanks, everyone. There's lots of really great questions coming in here, but I wanted to turn first, Ambassador Gaspard, to you, perhaps to pick up on Ian's point about whether or not we're making progress in this fight to support democracy, and what you think it takes.
Thank you so much, Blair. And of course, difficult to follow Berta. That was quite moving, and we're all in solidarity with her and with political prisoners the world over. So Ian made a number of terribly important and good points, and I don't like to disagree at all with my friend, but I want to caution us. When we say that we're making progress, it's important to lift up notes of optimism, but there has to be a sobriety here as well. Like Ian, to the point as to whether or not we turned out the would-be liberal autocrat here. I want to remind us, Ian, that 75 million of our fellow Americans voted to re-elect Donald Trump. And if he had managed to have a measure, a modicum of responsibility around the COVID response, he would be president of the United States again right now. That is a fact, irrespective of all of our mobilizing, all of our rhetoric against liberalism and fighting for democracy. That is just a quantifiable fact. There's also, and this is the point I really wanted to make here. If we look across the board, you can see the surge from Marine Le Pen right now in France. We see the supermajority that Viktor Orban just achieved in Hungary. We see the strides that some extremists in the GOP in the US are making right now as we head towards the midterms. It's important to understand that liberals like Donald Trump, like Bolsonaro, they don't just attack democratic institutions, they actually point out the hypocrisy and the failings of those institutions. When Donald Trump came out and told Americans that the system was rigged against them and that only he could fix it, folks voted for him precisely because they've seen corruption in both political parties, in their banks, in their institutions of higher learning. They feel as if there's not a way that plain average folk have an opportunity to get a leg up in the economy. Think about this in the United States alone. From 1979 to 2020, productivity increased for corporate America by 70%. In that same period, real wages only went up 12%. So folks really do understand that when people like us talk about democracy, when we talk about inclusive participation, that we're really, unfortunately, talking about systems that have benefited the few and have benefited elites. Look at what Russia did when they interfered in US elections. They created false sites on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, where they created the voices of African-American activists that they replicated to project frustration and exasperation with criminal justice reform, with housing, with academic inclusion, real challenges that exist in real communities that made them vulnerable and susceptible to hearing this kind of distorted amplification on social media. So let's just be really clear as we applaud our institutions, as we talk about this moment of enduring values and resilience, that there are profound vulnerabilities here. And if we don't get serious about them on the economic front, on the information exploitation front, because of runaway tech billionaires who are able to regulate themselves, if we don't get serious about this stuff, then all the other points that we're making are not going to be resonant and won't manage to make our institutions durable into the future.
Thank you, Ambassador. And there's a question here about tech, which we'll touch on perhaps in a minute. But I think the larger point that you're making is that this is about systems, and there are a number of donors, I suspect, watching and listening who are interested in systems change. And a question has come in about how donors, how philanthropies, and I'd be interested too in how we think governments can best support democratic development around the world through philanthropy and through funding. Alessandra, if I could turn to you on that one, what is your perspective on that?
I think that it's a hard question because there is a tension inherent to the role of philanthropy in this debate, right? Because philanthropy in many ways is, to, at least to a certain extent, a product of inequality. And inequality is in many ways what has brought us to this point where democracies are fragile. I couldn't agree more with what Patrick just said on how institutions have been really failing a lot of people. This is not something that people are imagining. This is not something that has been sort of manipulated out of them. The failures are real. There are a lot of people, the large majority of people, who are losing in this system, and they have been consistently losing for a while now. And that gap is getting wider. As it does, of course, people are going to question the institutions that sustain the system that they're living in. So it is absolutely about systems change, and I do see a very crucial role for philanthropy in that way. I know that my work wouldn't be possible without philanthropic support, and I know of many other activists who rely just as much as I do on that kind of support. But I think that the tension here is that in giving, philanthropists also need to be sort of really delving power, giving power away, not just money. And that's harder than giving money away, because there are many ways in which you can give money while even reinforcing a pattern of you having power and holding all the power, and that person who was receiving the money not having any and not holding on to any. So I think it's all about the way the philanthropy gives. And I know from my friends who work in philanthropy, from my partners in philanthropy, that a lot of philanthropic institutions are sort of rethinking that way of giving. But it is really crucial that in giving money, we really pay attention to the issue of power. Because if we don't, of course, that money will still maybe put to good use. And that is, in many cases, in the case of many philanthropic institutions, that is unquestionable. Like, of course, the money is being put to good use, but it's not necessarily changing the underlying dynamics that have left the majority of people, at least in my country, feeling like they are losing out of the system. They're not being included, not just in decision making, but in anything, in the way that we distribute resources that are a product of our economic system, etc. So that is, for me, the big tension here, right? And again, it doesn't mean that philanthropy shouldn't exist, of course. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have a role. It does mean that maybe it will sort of put itself out of work. It will put itself out of a job in a few years if we do this well, right? Because if we really change the dynamics powerfully enough, maybe we won't need philanthropy in a few decades, maybe. I don't know how optimistic I should be. But that is, I think, what we should be aiming at, is having a world that just has a little bit less inequality. And if that happens, then people can really maybe even fund things through their own networks of solidarity. I know crowdfunding doesn't make a dent for most organizations right now, but that's also because resources are very much concentrated in the hands of the few. If we have more resources in a more distributed way, maybe you would, etc. So I think there is a lot of work to be done there. And on the grantee side, we also need to sort of voice what we need in terms of sort of the power that we need to do our work, the decision-making power to define with our communities, with our staff, with our partners, the priorities of our work. And that relationship doesn't work unless we are vocal about that, unless we are clear about that, and we can really work with our philanthropic partners as partners, not in a sort of relationship where we just sort of listen and receive the money and then try to do our work without really showing up as partners in dialogue with philanthropy.
Thank you, Alessandra. We have a couple of questions here about the role of social media and technology companies in undermining democracy, and how we might regulate those companies or ensure that they support democracy one way or another. Patrick, Ali, could I turn to you? What would you say about how we can interact with tech and social media companies?
Yeah, I mean, first, I just wanted to really agree with what Patrick and Alessandra said. I think that a lot of the problem is people feeling disenfranchised. In the UK example of Brexit, I think a lot of people who lost their jobs in the 1980s when British manufacturing went through the floor and were forgotten ever since. That they owed Europe or anyone else no favors. They'd been forgotten. They wanted to make a mark. I think it's a big part of it. But sorry, to the question. Yeah, I can't answer every question on big tech. I'm not an expert on it, but I know that, in the work that we do, we have a team, Digital Threats Against Democracy, and we're looking at the role of social media in undermining democracy. And so, for example, Facebook, as everyone will know, came under massive focus because of the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, and Facebook's role in spreading hate speech. And when the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission went into Myanmar, they produced a report for the Human Rights Council, and they cited numerous examples of hate speech. So what we did at Global Witness is we picked 8 real examples that were from their report of hate speech, and then we submitted them in Burmese to Facebook. This was just, we reported this just in March, in the form of ads, to get them out there and keep perpetuating the hate speech. And Facebook had said, we've improved, we've heard all the criticism, blah, 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 blah. But we asked them if they would accept these ads, these 8 ads of hate speech. And they did in every case. I hasten to add, we pulled them, they didn't appear. But it just shows that they are out of control, these tech companies. And that's in an area where, rather like with Ukraine now, there are real human life costs of that kind of behavior. So big tech absolutely needs to come under much, much stricter regulation than it is now.
Thank you, Patrick. And Ian, perhaps turning to you on the same question, your focus is on the US, of course, the country where many of these companies are based. How do you feel we need to interact with them and to help ensure that they support positive trends in terms of democracy going forwards?
Yeah, one thing that's worth recognizing is that every time we've had a new media technology or new form of communication arise in human history, it has disrupted existing systems, it has put strains on existing systems until we figured out how to impose the proper set of rules on it so that it didn't undermine those systems. That happened with the book, and it happened with radio, it happened with television, it's happening with the internet and with social media and big tech. And I think that means we're going to need 2 things. We're going to need a new set of rules, very clearly, and we're going to need to enforce old rules, because there's a lot of old rules that govern our information landscape that are not being enforced as the information system becomes sort of the Wild West that isn't subject to some of that regulation. So on the new stuff, unfortunately, the United States Congress is broken. And if we're counting on the United States Congress to solve this problem, we're going to be waiting a very long time. The European Union, on the other hand, has been out there leading on imposing certain regulations in the new media space. They did it with digital privacy. They're now considering an omnibus piece of legislation that would regulate some of the social media platforms. And of course, if you regulate it there, it essentially means you're regulating it worldwide. If they were, for example, to impose something like algorithmic transparency in the EU, once those algorithms are transparent, they're transparent everywhere. And so the world really needs to be working on making sure that that piece of legislation is as robust as possible. But there are old rules too that simply need to be applied. So for example, in the United States and in many advanced democracies, it has long been against the law to spread disinformation that is false, that injures people. It's defamation. There are ways in which that is weaponized in harmful ways, as Patrick Alley alluded to earlier, but there's a lot of ways in which that polices the information landscape. And so we've stood up a project called Law for Truth at Protect Democracy that is bringing defamation litigation against some of those people who spread false and injurious disinformation about the 2020 election, because we need to impose the existing rules on the new Wild West of the information landscape. And lastly, if I may, I want to just go back a little bit to actually agreeing with something that Ambassador Gaspard said. He thought he was disagreeing with me, but I don't think he was, because I think he would agree with this. While we absolutely have to be clear-eyed about the threats that we face, and nobody's more clear-eyed than the founder of an organization that wakes up every day to protect American democracy about how dangerous the situation is. One of the autocrats' greatest tools is making people believe that their voice doesn't matter, is making people believe that participating doesn't matter. And so we have to have a balance between alluding to all the real dangers, and everything that Ambassador Gaspard said is absolutely true. We were this close to losing our democracy, and we still could lose it. But we have to look at how what we do actually can have an impact, because if people don't feel empowered, then they cannot participate in democracy. And we have to have that balance. And I'm guessing that my good old friend, Ambassador Gaspard, would agree that that balance is crucial to being aware of the dangers and empowering people to protect us from them.
Thank you, Ian. And Ambassador Gaspard, perhaps back over to you in the case that you might have any response to that, but also to touch on a question from Kathy, which I think gets to this idea of how we reconcile acting now and the immediate challenges to democracy versus the longer, deeper work that we've touched on here to shift systems. How do we make that balance or make those trade-offs?
So first thing I'd just say is all of us who are here on this panel are radical optimists. You can't do this work if you're not a radical optimist. In Brazil, in the United States, in London, et cetera, you just can't. So that's terribly important. And Ian, you're of course right that in every political system, people have got to feel as if they have agency and they have voice. But at the end of the day, we need to recognize that agency in our capitalist system comes from the ability to have access to resources, to have access to the basic provision of goods and services. And for far too long, Americans in in the heartland, in the coast, black and white, have lacked that access, and we can't address these challenges if we kind of strip away the politics of that kind of devolution out of our policy prescriptions. I'd also add, it's not, it's important to unpack all of these pieces here. Ian, you're right that Congress has had a devil of a time regulating these industries. And it's not simply because there's a kind of broken polarization in our Congress. It's because we have a corrupt lobbyist and ecosystem that exists in our Congress. And these are American companies that have influence with both political parties. They influence social movements too with their philanthropy. And that has thwarted the movement towards creating a regulatory framework that could have stifled some of the challenges that they've created in our politics. So let's just be really 100% clear of exactly what the challenge is if we're going to work to overcome it. And Blair, you'll forgive me, but I lost the thread on the last part of the question that you had posed.
Well, the question is, Ambassador, and not to worry, we can come back to you on that. Alessandra, if I could maybe turn it to you. Everything is a priority. There are so many challenges now to democracy. How do you prioritize in your work with NOSSAS? How do we know where to start to address some of these challenges?
It's a good question. I don't know what the answer is for everyone, but I know that at NOSSAS, we try to reconcile the sort of long-term strategy with the sort of more near-term urgencies in the following way. We look at what's urgent right now. We really do care about what people are feeling today, this week, this month, what matters to them right now. And that's what's put us in a position to really react when things have become unexpectedly difficult, right? For instance, when the pandemic started in Brazil, we led the coalition of 150 plus organizations that advocated quite successfully for emergency basic income to be implemented in the country for the bottom half of the population, 100 million families. And that was accomplished in the space of 3 weeks of intense public pressure, intense public scrutiny, and government just sort of had to comply. And that was something that we couldn't have done unless we had that ability to really react to what was needed at that time. But it doesn't mean that we're losing sight of the long term. And I think the way that we do that is by how we organize people. We may want to accomplish emergency basic income, but we don't want to do that by making a phone call to a secretary. We want to do that by organizing a large amount of people quickly, but a large amount of people so they can have that influence, so they can accomplish the change. And that way of doing, that's what builds the long-term strategy, because it builds power over time. So even though the goal of that campaign, the explicit goal of that campaign may have been to implement emergency basic income for the bottom half of the Brazilian population, and that was a very near-term goal, almost immediate. We wanted that to be done the next day because people were going hungry the next day. They couldn't wait a year or two. They couldn't wait a week or two, right? That was the explicit goal. But even though that was the explicit goal, the underlying sort of strategy was to build power, to build a large enough community of people who support that policy, who may build trust in each other, build an identity around that policy, have this sort of experience of victory, of winning something really meaningful through democracy, through the institutions of democracy. So we could then later on activate them again and again for other fights, for other causes, and build them as a sort of a constituency of people who have experienced what democracy can deliver for them. And that is where the longer term strategy comes in.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'm afraid we're running out of time. We could talk for hours, I think. What I'd like to do is turn to each of you, perhaps beginning with you, Patrick, Ali, to summarize what you'd like people to take away from this. The theme of the Skoll World Forum this year is Face Forward. If you would like the audience to remember in a few words how we collectively face forward and change the trajectory of democracy in positive ways, what would you say?
Thank you. I think, as I think virtually every panelist has mentioned, we need to reduce massively or remove the inequity that exists in all of our countries. I think we need to disarm the pinstripe army that I talked about, and I think we need to keep corporate money out of politics.
Thank you, Patrick. Over to you, Ian. Same question.
If you're attending this today, you're an ambassador for democracy. As Alessandra noted earlier, it's very tempting for someone to come along when things seem like they're not working and often aren't and say, I alone can fix it. But as we learned from Berta and what her husband is going through right now, that person, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, Vladimir Putin in Russia, never works out for the population. Democracy is a rare thing in human history. It takes protecting. It's up to us to convince people it's worth protecting, it's worth fighting for, it's worth improving. And anyone attending this is an ambassador who can help spread that message. The Ukrainians are our example. We need to be worthy of their allyship. I'm grateful to be able to participate, and thank you to everybody who's attending.
Thank you, Ian. Absolutely. We all have a role to play, large or small. Alessandra, over to you.
I just want to echo everyone else's words. It's an honor to be here and to be having this very difficult but very important discussion with you all. I think our work will be increasingly needed, unfortunately. These are really hard times, and the failures of our democratic institutions are bound to become even more apparent as sort of new crises that we're not used to start to appear, including the climate crisis and others. So we're going to need to do better, not just address declining support for democracy, but the underlying causes of that declining support as well.
Thank you. And finally, Ambassador Gaspard, over to you. How do we face forward and support democracy from here?
Thank you, Blair, and thank you to everybody else. We face forward by recognizing the power of networks. This extraordinary platform created by Skoll, all that you're doing in networking across philanthropy, the fact that we now recognize that the autocrats, the illiberals are networked with one another, Salvini, Bannon, Orban, all these folks are talking to one another. We have to recognize the power of our own network, husband our resources in a focused and strategic way, and recognize that we're not going to solve this all in one fell swoop. Democracy is something that is the responsibility of each generation to be vigilant towards. Frantz Fanon once said that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. This generation has an obligation and an opportunity to fulfill the mission of democracy for the next generation.
Thank you so much to our speakers for this fascinating discussion. All the best with your efforts to bolster democracy going forwards. Thank you to our audience for watching and for all the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. And thanks to the Skoll Foundation. There is a briefing right after this, if you're hanging around, on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. There are also two roundtable discussions starting right now as well, one on trolling disinformation and one on women fighting the democratic backslide. So much more to talk about. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of the forum.